Welcome to Parenthood Bites, the podcast where we explore life as a parent in tech. I'm your host, Chiao, and I have over 15 years of experience in tech, and I'm also currently working as a career coach. I'm the proud mother of 3 incredible boys. In each episode, we have an inspiring guest who will share their remarkable story. You'll find their wisdom and insights both relatable and enriching, because after all, we're all in this parenting journey together. So grab your favorite drink, get cozy, and let's dive into today's episode. Hi everyone, welcome to episode 1 of Parenthood Bites. We're here today with John, who is a senior staff software engineer and currently working as a consultant. Welcome, John.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
Awesome. We're so happy to have you here as well. So I'd like to start by asking what brought you to tech and how many years have you been in tech?
I've kind of been in tech since the beginning. In high school, I had friends who were making websites. This was like back in the GeoCities and like Netscape days.
Remember those days.
So I started teaching myself HTML, and then JavaScript, and then Linux. And by the time it was time to apply to college, I was pretty set on majoring in computer science. So during college, I interned at a few places. And then after I graduated, I started working as a software engineer. And I've been in tech about 17 years, I think, at this point, like full time. Before that, I had like weird, consulting part-time gigs or whatever, but like, help my mom's friend make a website or something. But I don't think that counts.
Yeah, I remember those GeoCity days. I had a website and I definitely had like some text that blinked and
We all have those sites.
Right? And we're like, oh my gosh, I know HTML. It was like amazing. I was like, I'm a coder.
Yeah.
So how many years were you working in tech before you became a parent?
I probably about 7 years. Yeah. And by then I was a senior software engineer, and I was at like a startup.
Oh, nice. How was that sort of like, I know startups can be demanding. Well, how how is that kind of handling some of that?
It so I think early career, my wife at the same time was kind of like going through school and kind of getting started in her career as well. And so I think both of us were like pretty focused on career, and we didn't have like kids or whatever to kind of take up all that other time, right? So it's like pretty easy to get, devote like a big chunk of my life to work. And even after work, I'd be tinkering with this stuff because, I got into it pretty early. And so those kind of like feedback on each other, in like a positive way. And then I think when I was going to have my first one, I was like, okay, like this is going to be a big change. Like I need to kind of dial it back. And then like the startup was like super intense. And I don't think I like really dialed it back at all. I think it was tough, but I kind of made it work. We can probably talk more about that like in future questions.
Yeah, yeah. And I think like it helps that you have a supportive wife as well who is kind of helping you probably balance out some of that. So just going back to kind of, having your first kid at startup, was there any like parental leave policy? I know when I was having a kid, it was like, no, not really. I had to use all my unpaid time off, vacation, sick days, all of that. What was that like?
I think so I had just started this job, and I think at the time their policy was like mirroring some of the like government stuff. So I think you had to be there for like a year before you were like eligible um for some of that assistance. So I basically didn't have paternity for the first child. And that was like my manager was pretty understanding at the time. And we had like 1 or 2 people that were like remote on the team anyway. So he let me work from home for gosh, I don't remember honestly. I feels like a year, but it was probably only just a couple months. So for a couple months, I was like at home, and yeah, I think that worked out like reasonably well. For my second child, the policy had been updated to be quite a bit more generous. So I think I had like a month, and I remember like years after that, as we continue getting bigger, they made it even more generous. I think a couple other big companies had announced like multi-month policies, and I think they followed suit. But I don't remember the details because I was done having kids at that point.
Yeah,
And
when
so I
you
was
don't
like,
have
oh,
them anymore.
yeah, I was like, oh, cool. That's very good of us. And then,
Yeah.
promptly forgot all the rest of the details because it wasn't going to apply to me. Yeah.
Yeah. So you mentioned kind of the difference between the parental leave and the first kid and the second kid. How many years apart were your two kids?
Two
Or are
years
they?
apart. Yeah.
Oh, wow. So that must have been interesting to juggle two young kids 2 years apart while at a startup. And you were able to work remote. That's nice because I think back then it wasn't common for people to be remote, right? Not like today.
Definitely. Yeah. Definitely not as like common of a thing for, as it is now with the pandemic and everything. So yeah. Yeah, like I said, I think it was helpful because like I already had one or two people on the team that were remote, and so it was
Yeah.
like, okay, I'm just going to be like them for a few months. Like we
Yeah.
conducted most of our stuff on like Slack and stuff anyway. So
Yeah, definitely. So after you had, your kids, was it hard kind of transitioning back to work? I guess if you didn't really have a leave and you were remote, it wasn't too bad, but what was that like?
yeah, I mean, I for the first one there wasn't really a transition per se. I mean, like in person versus like home was sort of the same. I
Yeah.
think for the second one, like on my side, I think I already had one kid, so
Hmm.
I wasn't like a brand new parent, right? So like that kind of helped. Although having two, I gotta say, is like much harder than you think it is. um, but on like the work side, some stuff had changed. So there was some like catching up to do, but being gone a month wasn't like everything had changed, right? Like a lot of stuff was still the same. I remember in particular we had hired like a good number of people actually. Like it was a pretty small team, and I think we'd hired like at least three people or something. So the team had grown significantly percentage wise, and so I felt like it was a little harder getting to know those people because it was like I wasn't there for day one, right? So like I had to kind of like work to build out those relationships um, a little harder, and then also I do remember there was kind of like an initiative that I was pushing for um, before I had left, and kind of the timing worked out such that I was like, okay, like we're kind of mostly there, like stay the course, finish this up, and then we'll be in a good place. And I remember coming back, and like that had basically totally fallen off. Like people got distracted by the next fire, and then they were like, okay, yeah, like we kind of finished it, but they not really, and then we kind of like moved on. So I don't know. It's hard to say that if I had not, like, if I would have been there, right? If we would have stayed the course and done the thing, but it's hard to say. But I think me not being there definitely didn't help things because then there was nobody to like sort of advocate for like that piece. In the grand scheme of things, it's like it's fine. I'm not saying like, oh, I shouldn't have taken the leave. Like definitely not. I think there were also some positive things out of me taking the leave. Like I was kind of one of the more tenured people on the team, and like me being gone for like the threat of me being gone for a month sort of forced a lot of like um, knowledge sharing and kind of like bus factor reduction that would otherwise maybe not have been done.
Yeah, yeah, and gives people the opportunity to kind of step up a little
Yeah,
bit.
yeah.
Cool. So, I know you weren't in the office at the time, but do you recall if there was like a mother's room for folks coming back to work?
So there was definitely a room set aside for like breastfeeding and pumping. Um, I know because our team was situated like right outside the door. It was kind of like in the corner there. I don't remember when exactly that was put into place. I feel like it was probably already there when we moved into that building. But I think when I first joined, we were in like a much smaller building, and I think nobody at work had kids because they were all like really young people. And so I don't know if we had one from the get go, but I definitely do remember like a couple years in, we had one, and I'm sure we've had one since. Yeah.
That's great. I know definitely in the beginning when there's not a need, it's like, oh, maybe not. And then as people have kids, they're like, oh, we got to do that.
Yeah, yeah. And I think the parental leave policy was like the same way, right? Like in the beginning, it was like
Hmm.
not a selling point, like nobody asked about it, right? So they just kind of like, okay, whatever, like, support from the government or whatever is like, that's fine. And then later people were like asking about it, and then they, kind of increasingly improved the program.
Yeah. And earlier you mentioned, your manager was pretty supportive. So were they also pretty supportive and receptive when you shared the news of, you're going to have a baby? How did they respond to that?
You mean for my second child?
Yeah, your second child or your first child.
Um, I think so. For the first one going in, they knew, and I said it kind of up front, because one of the things I negotiated really hard on was like healthcare.
Oh,
Because
nice.
initially they were like, oh, your for like healthcare coverage is going to start like a month after because of like the start dates or whatever. And I'm like, no, 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 that no, no, no. You're going to backdate my start date to like, I cannot have a healthcare coverage gap during this time because my wife
Yeah.
is pregnant. And, also, by the way, like I know I'm not going to be eligible for the policy, but I am going to have a kid. Like, I forget what it was, like 7 months or something like into my tenure here,
Mm.
actually less, 5 6 months into my tenure here. So they kind of knew up front, and my first manager was like, okay, yeah, that's cool, like you do you. And then I think by the time I had my second one, it was a different manager by then. But again, yeah, I feel like they were supportive. By I think the focus for them was around that knowledge sharing piece that I was talking about, where they were like, "Oh, great! Like, the senior person on the team is going to be gone for a month. This is, how can we make this an opportunity? Like, let's, really kind of like use this opportunity to like get out of like hair on fire firefighting mode and like try to do some concerted like knowledge sharing and stuff like that." So they were supportive. I've definitely heard of like coworkers who had less supportive managers, like, what, you're going to be gone, like you can't take that, like, but no, I didn't have any of that.
That's great. That's great to hear. And also, it's really awesome that you were able to negotiate it so well. Because I think a lot of people going into new jobs, they're just like, I don't know if I should mention it. So I think it's really good that you were able to do that. That's awesome.
Yeah, I guess I just sort of treated it as like a, this comes with the territory, right? It's like you're gonna get, and I would say this company was very good about like bringing your whole self to work, right, and encouraging that. So yeah, I was, yeah, you're gonna get all my skills, but you're also gonna get some of my life situation. Like that's how it's gonna go.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so important. So, how old are your kids today?
Yeah, I have two. They are 8 and 10, so they're in like just the older one's just finishing up elementary school this year.
Wow, so middle school next year, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, my older two are in middle school now, and it's different. It's very different than elementary. I'll give it that.
What's the you have any tips? What's like the biggest difference?
Yeah, I think like I wasn't prepared for all the things that other kids know. You know what I mean? Like they'll come back and they'll ask questions, and I'm like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Okay, we're not ready for that. And then they'll learn like bad words and stuff. But I just tell them like, just don't repeat it. You'll know it, right? Like you'll hear about it whether it's on TV in school, but just I don't want to hear it coming out of your mouth. Yeah, because I think a lot of middle schoolers they want to be cool, so they'll say a lot of bad words, and they're like, "Oh my gosh, people cuss so much." I'm like, okay,
You're not allowed to use those words until you work in tech.
yeah, and surround yourself with people who maybe don't use it with 90% of their vocabulary. You know.
Yeah, I think the only thing mine are bringing home is the latest one was like, oh, did you know you can write words on the calculator? Like, you like punch in the numbers and then flip it upside down. It's like, look, I can do eggs. I'm like, good, good for you. Yes, yes, you can.
Yeah, they learn interesting things, but 8 and 10 is a good age where they're like pretty self sufficient, right? But
Yeah.
like they still like you around, and so
Yes. Yes. Yes.
yeah, that's nice. So, how has your work life changed since you became a parent?
Um, I mean, I kind of touched on this earlier, right? Like before kids, I think, my wife was focused on, school or like her career. So I had a lot of time to devote to my career as well. I think also it was uh, like my life revolved more around work in that like my coworkers were also my friends because like I was younger like and so like the younger people would kind of like hang out, so I'd spend my weekend with those people anyway, but like as friends. I didn't really mind putting in like the extra hours so much, right? Because it was like, okay, like I'd hang out with these people otherwise, anyway. And, also I was interested in like the technology I was using and stuff. So I would be messing around with it after hours or whatever. I don't know. It sounds maybe a little pathetic, but it was like, very life was very like work centric
Of
in many ways.
course.
And then after kids, I don't know how much of it is just like a function of like, oh, now I have kids versus like I was also, like older, right? Like whatever, 7 years older, right? But like, I didn't hang out with my coworkers as much. Again, this is kind of the result of a job change, right? Like I was relatively older versus like some of the other folks at the startup. I lived, further away. And so like I skip some like after work, social events or whatever because I want to go home and like have dinner with my family so that like my kids remember what I look like. Cause if I come home like super late and like, I'm leaving, super early or whatever, like they might not actually see me for like a couple of days. And, at that age, they're like toddlers or whatever babies, like it's kind of a difference. So, they're less understanding, right, than they are, now when you're like, okay, yeah, I'm gonna work late, and they're like, okay, whatever. um I think after kids, like side projects, like I don't have time for as many of those or any of those, right? Like most of my time is like, okay, like I'm not going to go, investigate this new programming language or like, go mess around with this other thing. Like I'm going to want to spend that time with my kids. Either like directly or indirectly, right? Like either directly, like with them, like helping them with something or doing, or like indirectly, like, okay, now I'm talking to my wife about like, okay, when do we want to do swim class? And like, like all the things that you have to do kind of like around having kids, right? Like schedule play dates or like, whatever else, right? So I feel like most of my sort of non-work time gets sucked up by that. I think maybe like another kind of like big kind of tying this back to work. I would say like before, I would say sort of like priorities in life was kind of like work first. Um, and then now it was like work and family are like equal, if not like trying to push family like ever so slightly higher, right? So it's like this big shift where it's like, you know now you have like two things to juggle as opposed to like, oh well, it was really like as an example, right, is like before it was like if I have a work meeting scheduled, then it was like, okay, cool, like I'm not going to do anything else because I have like to get on a call or be at the office at a certain time, whatever.
Mhm.
Now it's like, okay, but like my kid has either school at that time or like maybe a school event or like something, right? And like, and especially if it's like recital or like concert, so it's like, okay, well, that's not like something that you can just like, oh yeah, my wife can drop them off. It's like, okay, I should be there, but then I also said this other thing, and it's like, okay, now what do you do, right? Like now there's like these sources of conflicts. Whereas before it was like, oh yeah, okay, like I'll hang out with my friends later, like I have to be there at that time, and like that's no big deal, right? Or like I can tell my wife like, oh no, we're not going to get dinner that day, like I have a meeting that day. Like, so, and, she would understand and that's no big deal. So that I think was like a huge change where it was like, oh, now I have like two very high priority things that I have to juggle.
Yeah, and that's the thing too, where a lot of those activities or even school events, they don't think about like, okay, parents get off work at this time, we'll do it at this time. No, it's like we had back to school night and it was like 4. And I was like, how, if you work far, you got to leave work that much earlier, or you have to just take the afternoon
Yeah.
off and things like that,
Yeah.
right?
I I've definitely thought a lot of times, like, I get it, like, they're trying to make it, as late as they can in the day. Like, you can't have it, at like 9 or 10 PM when it would actually be convenient. But like, you know, on the other hand, it's like, I mean, yeah, like, I, I mean, I guess working in tech for most roles, I think, is like somewhat flexible, right? Where it's like, okay, you might have to cancel some meetings or whatever, but like usually you're not like, have to be there, present or something. Like my wife works in healthcare, so it's like when she takes time, like she's not seeing patients, right? Like that's like actually not
Mm.
happening. So I mean, I think we have some advantages being in tech, but yeah, absolutely. Like some things are hard.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. Um, so, I was curious, sort of, having 2 kids, having been a parent for a while now, what would you say has been like your biggest struggle or biggest challenge being a working parent?
I think like being present with my kids is something that I feel is like my biggest sort of personal struggle. And, sometimes that's like, you know, making the time to like be there. But like, even when I'm physically like there, having the sort of like mental energy left at the end of the day to like actually engage with them is like challenging, especially when they're kind of younger. And it's like, um, like uh, the things they're interested are not like adult things, right? They're like, oh, look, I made this drawing. And it's like, okay, that's cool. But, it's just not as like you really have to put a lot of energy to engage with them in a meaningful way when that's kind of where they're at. And yeah, I find that like at the end of a workday, it's hard to like conjure up that much energy. Now they're a little
Yeah.
older, but like it still, I think, takes a lot of mental energy to like actually know what they're studying, right? Like who their friends are and like really listen like actively to them, what they're interested in, right? And sometimes it's not direct, right? Like sometimes it's like you just have to listen to them enough to know sort of statistically, like, okay, they talk about this a lot, like that's what they're interested in, right? But like if you're not kind of actively listening and like really putting in that mental energy, I feel like it's very easy to be like, oh yeah, okay, cool, that's nice, yeah, and then not really engage with them at that level. And I feel like that's like an opportunity that I'm going to regret, like, later. So I think that's like probably my biggest like eternal struggle. I think the other kind of like big one is like being an equal partner. Um, so like when I have like a lot of stress at work, my wife, who is not in tech, right? She's in healthcare. She sort of ends up taking over, right, in terms of like managing the kids, school stuff, extracurricular, play dates, meals, all that kind of stuff, right? And she's supportive, and we've both decided, that's kind of like what's best for the family, but like it doesn't feel great to me, in terms of like my values, and falling into those like very traditional like gendered roles. So I that's another struggle I have, is like to try to not dump everything on her when I'm having a tough time, on with work. I think on the work side, um, uh, I mean, I guess it's a struggle, but like maybe also kind of a strategy, is like trying to find projects and roles where I can add value, but in like a sustainable way. So a lot of what that looks like, I think, is like playing to my strengths and like leveraging my experience, um, and as opposed to just like putting in a ton of time, but like non-differentiated time, right? Like things that other people could also do just as well, right? But sometimes that means possibly taking like a less risky project, or not going hard after a promotion, right? So there's trade-offs there, and some struggle with that. But I feel like I've struck like an okay balance on that side.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you mentioned that because I think a lot of times we're kind of in that struggle between like, do I take that more high visibility project? Do I take that thing? Do I go for that promotion? Or do I take something that's less, you know, less risky, less out there? And it's kind of having that mindset of like, okay, which one, what am I prioritizing? And I think going back to what you mentioned about like, when you have a more stressful day, you don't want to put it all on your wife, although sometimes it may happen that way. But it's really awesome that you're aware of that and you're like, no, 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 let me think about how to help out. And I think I see that in myself too. Sometimes when I have a really hard day, I go to my husband, I'm just like, I'm sorry, you you figure out dinner,
Yeah.
you put the kids to bed, you figure out those things, because I just don't have the energy. And in fact, I'm still thinking about
Yes.
work, even, right?
Yes.
Even at that,
Yes.
you're like signed off, your computer's off, but your mind is still going
Yes.
on about that. And I'm like, I just can't be there.
Yeah.
And I have so much regret for some of the times when my kid, when they're young, like you said, they want to tell you all the things.
Yes.
And I'm just like, I don't know what you're talking about, and I don't have the energy to figure it out.
Yeah, no, totally.
Right?
Because like the mind space in your head is still loaded with all of those like work problems, right? Like,
Yeah.
yeah, it's interesting because my wife is in healthcare. I feel like we have very like different things, right? Like, I think in tech, it's like even though your computer is off, like you said, it's you still have those problems kind of bouncing around in your head. Um, you know, the whole like shower thing, right? Like, you've got this, like, you're just showering in the morning or whatever, and you've got this great like work related idea, right? And you're like, where did that come from? Like, I guess I'm still thinking about it. But I think for her, like most things, it's like, okay, I see this patient for like whatever, 30 minutes or whatever, and then I'm on to the next one. And like usually, unless it's, particularly memorable for some reason, usually it's like, okay, I'm not, going home and like continuing to think about that, you know, 8 different ways to solve that problem, right? If it's that complex, like refer to a specialist and then move on.
Yeah, like she can have that disconnection at the end of the day.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's trivial, but like it does seem a little bit easier. Yeah, for
Right.
that kind of role. But I think I mean, there's lots of advantages of working in tech, but I think this is like one of the trade-offs, right? Is like you never really get to shut it off.
Yeah, absolutely. So, kind of talking a little bit about that in a little more, detail, I guess. So, sort of, how do you achieve that work-life balance? Like over the years, what have you done to kind of help yourself feel a little bit more balanced on both sides?
I feel like the question implies that I have achieved this balance, and which
I know it's something we're all working on, and like, maybe something that works today didn't work
yeah,
2 years ago, or, but like, what do you
yeah.
do
I
today?
think balance may be overstating things a little bit, but I would say that I think, yeah, you're right. The strategy kind of changes depending on, kind of where you are in your career and how old your kids are and, everything else, right? So I think for me, there were sort of two major phases. Like early career, I think I was, more junior, more hands on, and like amount of contribution and like impact of contribution was like very directly tied to like hours of effort put in, right? Like, oh, push that incremental PR, push that incremental, code change. um the kids were younger, right? Like they were kind of, baby toddler phase. um and I think my strategy then was just to kind of try to do both at once, like rather than trying to do like work and then home, one or the other, kind of very strict boundaries. I just kind of like did both, right? And this is also shaped because like I didn't really have leave, like I was at home, but then like I was also trying to care for my kids, right? So like yeah, like I'd like just be on meetings or like push code, baby in my lap, like did that for a while. They I remember like she wanted to like bang on the keyboard, right? And like so that was not working for me. So I found like an old keyboard, just had it like on my desk, like an unplugged one, right? It's like, okay, you bang on this one and I'll bang on this one. Right. But then, she felt more involved, right? Like I didn't want her to be like, oh, okay, don't touch a keyboard. That's bad. Right. In fact, kind of the opposite. I wanted, them to possibly kind of, be comfortable with tech. Right. But like, um, yeah, so I think I just kind of tried to do both. I think, yeah, like I remember when they were babies, like I like if I'd be on call or whatever, like I'd handle like the schedule worked actually pretty well. Like I'd handle like some outage or something in the evening, and then like the kid would be sort of asleep, and then like my wife would be like asleep. Kid wakes up, I'm kind of done handling. I'm like, okay, I got to get things wrapped up by like 12:30 or 1 because the kid's going to wake up. Go, kid wakes up, change their diaper, kind of like get them all prepped for feeding, hand off to mom, and then go back to like monitoring, like whatever remediation for the outage, right? Like this happened on several occasions and it was like, oh, this is perfect. Like I'm already up and awake. Everybody else is still like, oh, I'm getting paged at like 1 a.m. I'm like, yep, I just handed off my kid. Like, here's the situation. Here's, here's what we're doing. um, so that was kind of like early career. I think later career, as more senior, I think the focus shifted to, technical leadership and like kind of soft skills more, right? Where, a lot of my work and value is actually like communication with others, as opposed to just like, pushing that incremental amount of code. And so, it had to be done during the day anyway, right? Like I can't, I'm not like scheduling like one-on-ones or like, architecture review meetings at like 1 a.m. or whatever. So, the incremental time spent doesn't translate as directly to, sort of the results and the impact, right? So I think that sort of lent itself to more of a different strategy where I'm, trying to compartmentalize a little bit more between work and home, right? I'll stop working at the end of the day because everybody else has stopped working and like, I can no longer sort of engage with them. And so that's a good cue for me to go and like disconnect and try to engage with my family.
Yeah, that's interesting how you broke it down into kind of the two stages of your career and also as your kids grow up, like that's what's how it worked for you. And I'm totally just picturing you. I know the listeners can't see, but I'm picturing you with your baby on your lap on the keyboard. I feel like in today time, that would be like a meme or something where the parent is holding the kid.
If I dig hard enough, I have pictures. I do remember. So
That's very
yeah.
memorable. So how do you kind of relax or unwind? Do you have any tips for our listeners of like, what's worked for you? If
I feel like this should have been back on the list of the things when you were asking what I struggle with. um, I don't know. I feel like with work and just like culture in general, like hustle culture in general, like I have this like guilt around like relaxing, right? Like I always feel like I should be doing something more productive. Like so yeah, I do struggle with that a little bit. Like one of the way this manifests is like one of the sort of like hobby, I guess you could call it hobby, is like I do like home improvement or like home automation stuff, right? Because it's like kind of geeky and like kind of scratches that like software side project itch. But then it's like, oh no, but like I'm improving like the house, like I'm doing something for like productive, right? Like for the family. So then it like kind of assuages like some of that guilt. But I think beyond that, I mean, I don't know. Sometimes like my wife likes to veg out and like watch TV, so sometimes I'll just join her. I also like get the kids into gaming. So like I used to work for like a gaming. Actually, that's where we have some history. But yeah, I try to get the kids into gaming and um, play with them sometimes, some multiplayer games, or oftentimes like they won't be into a game. Like I'll buy like read reviews and stuff and buy a game thinking that they'll like it, but then they won't like get into it, so I'll just have to start playing it, and then like once I'm past like the tutorial level or whatever, they're like super into it. And then like they finish it from there.
That's awesome. It's something you can do with them
Yeah.
too. Are they into Minecraft yet?
Oh, they they have untold hours in my, I'm positive. I'm positive that not only do they have more hours than we do in Minecraft, I would estimate at least 5 times as many hours.
Oh my gosh.
Their
See,
their creative world, I think, is like 8 gigs or more. It's
wow.
huge. It's huge. Um, it's funny too because like the way they play Minecraft is like very different, right? Like they'll do all like when the what was the I'm embarrassing myself now. They added the new mob that like comes out of the ground and like is really scary. So they'll like spawn that mob on purpose, and then they'll like do like a battle royale. Like they'll spawn a bunch of like iron golems or something, and like how many iron golems does it take to kill like this super powerful mob? Like they'll all sorts of weird things that like we did not do.
Wow, I don't even know what an iron golem is. I would tell my kids, I would be like, I when I played Minecraft, it was in beta, and they're like, "What?" And my account still works. So I actually gave it instead of buying 3 accounts, I gave one of my accounts to one of the
Oh,
kids.
okay.
So they're actually still using mine, but I'll just tell them like, I used to go mining late at night and and they're just like, okay, whatever.
Yeah, they do not do that. They do not like hunting for diamonds
Yeah.
or whatever, but they'll build a bunch of stuff in creative. They'll also play in our survival world sometimes. But yeah, I think they kind of like creative a little more. But they'll
Yeah.
yeah. My brother actually plays with us, and then I'll play sometimes. So I kept my account so that we could all be online at the same time. But like my brother will go explore or whatever. So like he like did like another portal over to like the beach area, and then like they're like, oh look, like this is the vacation spot. so so they'll be like, oh yeah, like we're going on vacation with your brother, with
That's
uncle.
so cute. Aw.
So
They could all just play together with the
yeah,
adults and
yeah,
stuff.
it's pretty funny.
That's awesome. I wanted to ask, just out of curiosity, what are some home improvement projects that you've done?
um it's just like smart lighting stuff, or like I started doing some blinds. Like we have a guest room, and ideally like during the day, like the blinds would be up so it's not so dark, and then at night, like it's better to have some privacy. But like the way the furniture is situated is just like hard to reach. Also, all of our blinds are cordless because when we had babies, we like were like, oh, okay, like cords can strangle babies, right? So like we can't
Right.
have any cords anywhere, so then it's like kind of hard to reach. So I was just like, okay, now we have motorized blinds, and then they actually go up and down on their own, depending on the sunlight cycle or whatever. So like sunset, sunrise. So like it's just little things like that. But
That's
the
cool.
tech required to make that work behind the scenes is like there's a Raspberry Pi and like a Zigbee network, and like there's Home Assistant and like all this crazy a server. Like there's so many pieces required to like actually make that work the way I want it to. So it provides kind of a playground for things.
Wow, that's really neat. Yeah, that sounds like a lot of work, but it sounds pretty awesome. Um, so I guess like, with your kids right now being 8 and 10, what are some of the struggles today?
Um, I think in the beginning, right? It was a lot about like meeting their physical needs, right? Like feeding, changing diapers, sleeping, all that kind of stuff. Now that they're older, it's like higher level stuff, right? Trying to teach them to be empathetic, right? Like helping them with schoolwork, like teaching them life skills. Um,
Hmm.
so maybe this is like tech specific or something, but like at this age I worry a lot about like striking the right balance with various things. For example, like with their schoolwork, it's like, okay, like how much help do I give them, right? Like if I give them too much help, I'm like doing for them. Or like like how high of a standard should I set, right? like, obviously the teacher will grade it, but then like, I might nitpick on a few things. And then like, you know, on the one hand, it's like I want to set a high standard, but on the other hand, like it might end up being counterproductive because then I'm eroding their confidence, right? Or like, if they think it's ridiculous, then, they're just going to start rebelling, right? So like, I feel like there's a lot more nuance here in, whereas before it was like, okay, fed or not fed, like diaper changed or not changed. It's like a little more binary. But now it's like, ooh, okay, I'm not really sure like exactly where to like strike these balances. I think maybe another thing is like setting the right example, right? Like again, this isn't something that you deal with quite so much when they're, super young, but like, you know, at this age it's like I can tell them how to treat others, but if I'm not modeling like that behavior, right, with them, with my wife, with other people, then that actually is the lesson that they're going to take away, not what I said, right? So yeah, I mean, you have to kind of be very mindful of that. And I guess, maybe to bring it back to work a little bit, like where this intersects with work is like, I want to be present with them, um, and like kind of abstract work from them in a way, right? Where it's like, it's not really fair if I like dump on them, like, oh my God, these are the things that I'm like dealing with at work. But on the other hand, like, I don't want to completely hide work from them because I want them to see that aspect of, being an adult, being a parent, and like, modeling a good work ethic for them. Um, so it's like, again, one of these balance things where it's like, okay, like, how much do I tell them, and like, how much do I show them? How much do I kind of let them into sort of the work life bubble? Um, and yeah, that's sort of maybe I'd say like the current thing. It sounds like it's going to get a whole nother level of hard once they like start hitting middle school and beyond. But I think that's sort of where my mind has been at the last 2 years.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, like I find myself doing that too, where it's like I want to tell them some of the things about work so they know what it's like working, being a working parent, but I also don't want to be like, oh my gosh, did you know this happened? And I cannot handle this. And I don't want to be all like ranting, venting to them. And like, yeah, in middle school and stuff, my kids are actually getting real grades. In elementary, it was like 1 to 4. And, they'd come back with threes and fours or occasional twos. And I'm like, okay, cool. It's numbers. We never got that growing up. So whatever. But now it's like, oh, I have a 96% in this class and 89. And I'm like, oh my God, it's feeling very real, and I find myself also going like, okay, I don't want to necessarily be the tiger parent to
Yeah,
just be like, you have to study all the time. But I also want them to know they should try their best, and I always tell them like, just try your best. It doesn't matter what grade you get in the end. Like, just do your best. And if I know you're trying, that's what matters to me. um but I find them being harder on themselves, like they'll come back and they'll be like, I got a A- on this, I shouldn't have missed that. And I'm like, don't be too hard on yourself, because I want them to also be kids too, and kids grow up so fast now. I
yeah. I
realize.
I guess in terms of like the, how like what to show them, I guess like I look for opportunities to draw parallels between like their schoolwork and
Mm.
work, right? Where, like like the other day, I forgot which kid, but like they didn't bring home like the math workbook, right? And they need to like do the workbook out of that. And so I was like, hey, you got to be responsible for your own stuff. Like at work, I'm responsible for my own stuff. Like what happens if I forget to, do this thing, right? Like then this thing won't happen. And then, these are all these negative consequences that would happen if it were me, right? So, I try to make it relatable to them without all the nitty gritty of like, everything, right? But it's like, hey, look, these sorts of responsibilities that I'm asking you to like take on do not go away, and they just get, more severe, right? As you get older and are responsible more for things. And I don't know. Again, that's like a balance, right? Like sometimes I get the sentiment from them. They're like, "Oh, it sucks to be an adult. I don't want to grow up. Like I want to stay a kid. Just like play tetherball at recess." And I'm like, "Yeah, okay." Like they ask me, it's like, "Oh, would you rather be a baby or do you like being an adult?" And I'm like, "Well, I think I like being an adult because like at the same time, like you have a lot of choice in what you do, and right, like it's not all bad. But yeah, I mean, you do have to increasingly get your act together. And so right now the consequences, you're gonna get like a whatever, a check mark minus on your homework, but like later that might translate to significant financial losses for a company. Like you know
Yeah, absolutely. My kids actually come to me and they go, "We wish we were adults because then we could eat candy whenever we want and we can watch TV whenever we want and not have homework." I'm like, "But you got to work. You can't watch TV while you're working." They're like, "Yeah, but you don't have to do homework after." I'm like, "Well, sometimes there's work you have to, follow up on and things."
Yeah. I think on the candy front, like we've tried to sort of like give them a little rope and like
Mm.
have them understand their own consequences. Like there's definitely been a couple times where like, okay, that's your like fourth one, and we don't recommend it, but okay. And then later it's like, oh, I have a stomach ache. Like, it's like, so remember when we told you about that fourth one? You probably should. So now they're like better about those sorts of things where they'll self regulate, where they're like, okay, I'm gonna stop after one. It's actually two, but like they're like, oh, but
But
this,
they'll
yeah.
realize it.
Well, they're like, oh, but that
So,
was this kind of
yeah.
candy and that was that kind of candy, right? But like, they'll stop at a reasonable time because they kind of remember the consequences. So I think there's definitely a little bit of that where it's like you have to let them run with it a little bit because like they're not going to listen to you if you're just like, no, absolutely not. But like try to encourage them to like, okay, think this through. What will happen?
Hmm. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's very interesting. So we're almost out of time, so I like to end with kind of asking you, what's something you wish you knew as a person in tech? What's something you wish you knew before you had kids, or something you wish someone had told you before you became a parent in tech?
I mean, there's a lot of advice out there that's just like not necessarily tech specific around, but I think for someone specifically like in tech, um, like being a parent is hard, right? Especially a new parent. And there's like a lot of parenting advice out there. Some of it's conflicting, some of it's unsolicited. And as I was talking about earlier, right? Like, you now have a kid. It's like this huge, new, important priority in your life, and it's like a really big change, and that can be scary. But I also think that if you're in tech, you're probably pretty decent at sorting through information and figuring out what's important, right? You're also probably used to new priorities being dumped on your lap, sometimes at the last minute, right? And doing triage and figuring out how to like work with that, right? You're used to handling change, right? Because like the tech industry changes like really, really fast. So, I'd say big picture, like, you use those skills, right? Like try not to get overwhelmed. Like it's a challenge, sure, but like if you're somewhat successful in tech, like you're probably used to dealing with, a lot of challenges. And continuing with the work analogy, maybe make sure to take some time for yourself, so that you don't burn out. Right, just like you can work like crazy and just kind of flame out. Like it's the same, I think, with the kid, right? If you're like, oh, like I've got to do all of these things, and then you still have work bearing down on you, like you're gonna burn out, right? So whatever strategy works for you to not burn out at your day job, like continue applying that, but also be like recognize that you also have to apply that like on your personal like life. And same goes for partner, right? Like make sure you support your teammate just like you would support a teammate at work, and like help load balance or play to strengths or whatever strategies work for you, right? Like apply those as well so that your partner doesn't burn out. And maybe kind of like the final thought is like even though a lot of time you feel like you're just endlessly multitasking, kind of just jumping between everything, right? Like make sure to find some time to do the equivalent of like that heads down kind of like focused work, right? Like I talked about this earlier, like really be present. um you got to find time to like do that, and kind of like enjoy the moment. Like they grow up really fast. So if you miss that opportunity, it's kind of gone.
Yeah, they definitely do. In the blink of an eye, like they're taller than me. Well, not yet, but soon. And I really love these work and life analogies. That's absolutely true. I think like one of the biggest things we can do for ourselves is to make sure we don't burn out, like you said, in both ends. Um, but yeah, thank you so much for being on our podcast today, John, and for sharing your stories and experiences. It was really nice talking to you.
It was nice
Thank you.
talking to you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us today on Parenthood Bites. We hope you found our episode informative and entertaining. If you're a parent in the tech world or know someone who is, we'd love to hear from you. Please reach out to us at chow@parenthoodbites.co, and we'll be thrilled to add your experiences to our interviews. That's Chiao, CHIAO, at parenthoodbites.co. And to our potential sponsors out there, if you're a business or know of one that would like to support and partner with our podcast, please don't hesitate to get in touch. You can also reach us at chow@parenthoodbites.co. Thank you once again for tuning in, and we wish you a fantastic rest of your week. Until next time, take care and stay curious.